Resident Evil is one of the most iconic franchises in gaming history, but let's be honest, it's also one of the messiest. Across nearly 3 decades, Capcom has built a universe riddled with contradictions, bizarre design choices, and creative decisions that still divide fans to this day. So let's break down the 9 biggest problems haunting this franchise, starting with the one that almost tore the whole thing apart, the action horror identity crisis. Resident Evil doesn't know what it wants to be, and honestly, it hasn't known for over 2 decades now. The original trilogy was built on a simple promise. You are weak, the world is dangerous, and every bullet matters. Fixed camera angles meant you couldn't see what was around the corner. Tank controls meant you couldn't just sprint away from danger. The games were designed to make you feel trapped. Then Resident Evil 4 happened. Shinji Mikami didn't tweak the formula, he burned it to the ground. 4 separate versions were scrapped before he landed on the over-the-shoulder camera that would redefine third-person shooters entirely. And it worked. Resident Evil 4 is one of the most celebrated games ever made, but it opened a door that Capcom couldn't close. Resident Evil 5 cranked the action, co-op gameplay, daylight firefights, Chris Redfield going from traumatized survivor to military action figure. Resident Evil 6 made it worse, splitting into 3 campaigns that tried to be everything to everyone. Quick-time events everywhere. Vehicle chases, you could barely call it horror anymore. So when Resident Evil 7 dropped in first person with a creaky plantation and 0 bombastic set pieces, fans collectively exhaled. But that game still had to exist in the same universe where Chris punches boulders and Leon Roundhouse kicks cultists. The tonal whiplash isn't just between eras, it's baked into the franchise's DNA now. The community is permanently split. One camp wants tank controls back, another thinks 4 perfected the balance, a third just wants the atmospheric dread of 7. Capcom has to serve all 3, which means every new release is less of a game announcement and more of a declaration of war. But if the identity crisis is the franchise's biggest philosophical problem, then the thing that makes its lore physically painful to follow is somehow even messier. The overcomplicated virus mutation logic. Resident Evil's virus lore starts off elegantly with the progenitor virus, the canonical origin of nearly every outbreak and bioweapon. This pathogen infects literally all life form, from bacteria to plants to animals, making it the perfect in-universe explanation for the series' nightmarish creatures. Umbrella's early experiments focused on taming and mutating this base virus, leading to the infamous T-virus created by James Marcus, which kickstarted the disasters that define the franchise. But here's where it spirals into a convoluted mess. Umbrella didn't stop at the T-virus. Over the decades, countless variants popped up. T-Veronica, the G-virus, Ouroboros, the C-virus, and fungal strains like the Mutamycete. Each new strain was introduced to justify new enemy types and plot twists, drifting further from the neat, unified origin the progenitor virus promised. The result? Mutation logic that ranges wildly, from reanimated zombies to hyper-intelligent bioweapons capable of strategic combat without any clear biological consistency. Why do some viruses turn victims into shambling, brain-dead zombies, while others produce monsters who can use weapons, communicate, and even lead armies? Why do outbreaks sometimes explode uncontrollably, but other times remain suspiciously contained? The virus rules keep changing based on what's convenient for the story. This sprawling viral ecosystem works as a flexible storytelling tool. Capcom can throw in whatever new menace they want under the umbrella of virus mutation, but it also erodes narrative stakes and frustrates fans who crave consistent infection mechanics. Some appreciate the rich virus taxonomy and all the unique horror themes it enables, while others dismiss it as a confusing tangle of contradictions that breaks immersion. Resident Evil's virus mutation logic embodies a core franchise tension, an elegant origin concept undermined by an ever-expanding, contradictory monster menagerie. And if you thought viruses getting out of hand was messy, just wait till we talk about the gameplay mechanic that still has fans divided after all these years. The stationary shooting mechanic legacy. You cannot move and shoot at the same time in classic Resident Evil. That's not a bug, that's not a hardware limitation. That is the entire point. When Capcom designed the original Resident Evil in 1996, they made a deliberate choice. The moment you raise your weapon, your feet are glued to the floor. You aim, you fire, and you pray that whatever's shambling toward you drops before it reaches biting distance. Combined with fixed camera angles and tank controls, every zombie encounter felt like a life or death gamble. You weren't an action hero, you were a person with a gun who had to stop everything just to use it. And here's the thing, it worked beautifully. You couldn't kite enemies, you couldn't circle strafe around a licker. You had to commit, turn, plant, aim, shoot, and accept that during those 2 seconds of animation, anything could close the gap. The tension wasn't just about ammo scarcity, it was about the fact that defending yourself required you to become a sitting duck. When Resident Evil 4 overhauled everything to over the shoulder in 2005, Capcom still kept stationary shooting. Leon could aim with precision, pivot freely, but the second that laser sight came up, his boots might as well have been nailed to the floor, which is, not ideal when a chainsaw guy is sprinting at your face. The community is split clean down the middle. Old school players will tell you stationary shooting is Resident Evil, that the restriction forces genuine panic when you miscount your shots. Newer players see a relic that belongs in a museum next to memory cards and CRT televisions, but here's where it gets complicated. Modern horror games have largely abandoned this approach, and many of them struggle to recreate the specific dread those old games generated so effortlessly. Turns out, when you can sprint and hipfire simultaneously, something subtle gets lost. But if a control scheme debate sounds tame, wait until we talk about the moment Resident Evil went completely off the rails tonally. And yes, it involves punching a boulder. The boulder punching tonal shift. Chris Redfield punches a boulder, a literal geological boulder, in a volcano, and the game expects you to help him do it by mashing buttons. I don't know what to tell you. This single QuickTime event in Resident Evil 5 has become the unofficial mascot of everything that went wrong with the franchise's mid-series identity. Not because it's the only ridiculous moment, but because it perfectly crystallizes the gap between what Resident Evil used to be and what it had become by 2009. Here's the thing. In 1996, Chris Redfield was a STRS officer who could barely survive a mansion full of slow-moving zombies. He had limited ammo, a knife that was basically decorative, and the physical presence of a guy who maybe went to the gym 3 times a week. Fast forward 13 years, and this same character is built like a refrigerator with arms, squaring up against a rock formation like it personally insulted his family. The progression from vulnerable man with a handgun to geology's worst nightmare happened gradually enough that each step seemed reasonable. Zoom out, and the trajectory is genuinely insane. And the community knows it. The Boulder Punch has lived rent-free in Resident Evil discourse for over 15 years. Roger Craig Smith, who voiced Chris in later entries, has openly leaned into the meme. TikTok compilations still circulate the clip. Fans treat it with this weird mixture of genuine affection and pointed critique, which is honestly the only appropriate response to watching a survival horror protagonist fistfight the Earth's crust. But beneath the laughter, there's a real problem. When your protagonist can physically overpower terrain, you've lost something fundamental. Horror requires vulnerability. It requires the audience to believe the character could die. Chris punching that boulder told the audience, on a subconscious level, that nothing in this world could actually threaten him, which is, not ideal for a horror franchise. But if you think a protagonist punching rocks is a problem, wait until you hear about the characters Capcom punched right out of the storyline entirely. The abandoned plot threads and missing characters. Rebecca Chambers is either one of the most compelling characters in Resident Evil, or the franchise's most neglected asset. Either way, she's been sidelined from the mainline games for over 20 years, and it took a pair of CG movies for Capcom to remember she exists. Here's the thing. Rebecca debuted as an 18-year-old STRS medic in the original game, starred in Resident Evil 0, survived insect and animal bows that would traumatize most people into permanent retirement, and then just vanished from the games. No numbered sequel, no arc, no closure in the mainline series. She did resurface as a major character in the CG films Resident Evil, Vendetta, 2017, and Resident Evil, Death Island, 2023, reuniting with Chris, Jill, Leon, and Claire, but that only underlines the point. The character clearly still has story potential, yet Capcom keeps parking her outside the games that actually define the canon for most fans. And she's not alone. The Outbreak series introduced an entire roster of civilian survivors with real depth. Alyssa Ashcroft, for example, had genuine story potential that went absolutely nowhere in the mainline canon. These characters existed, mattered within their games, and then Capcom moved on like they never happened. Cool. Add that to the list. The pattern is always the same. Capcom introduces compelling side characters, builds fan attachment, then funnels all narrative resources back into the same 3 or 4 leads. Chris, Leon, Jill, occasionally Claire. Everyone else gets a filing cabinet in the basement labeled, maybe later. Except later never comes. What makes this worse is the fragmentation it creates. You've got unresolved corporate conspiracies, survivor communities from Raccoon City that were never revisited, and bioterror organizations locations introduced in one game, only to be quietly forgotten by the next. The universe feels less like a cohesive world, and more like a collection of disconnected episodes that share a logo. Fans notice. They've been vocal about it for years. Community posts still circulate asking when Rebecca comes back. Fan projects literally invent descendants of forgotten characters just to give those storylines some form of continuation. When your audience is doing your narrative homework for you, that's not dedication, that's a red flag. The result is a franchise with enormous storytelling potential that consistently refuses to use it. Every abandoned thread is a missed opportunity to deepen the world, reward long-term fans, and make the universe feel like it actually remembers itself. But if forgotten characters frustrate you, wait until we talk about a system that's been frustrating players since 1996, except this one involves your entire inventory. Inventory management friction. Here's something nobody ever talks about when they praise Resident Evil's horror. Half the tension in those games didn't come from zombies. It came from staring at 8 inventory slots and realizing you physically cannot carry everything you need to survive. The original games gave you almost nothing. 6 to 8 slots depending on the title, and every single one mattered. You want that shotgun? That's a slot. Ammo? Another slot. A healing herb? Gone. And now you're standing in front of a key item you need to progress, doing mental arithmetic like you're filing taxes in a war zone. But here's the thing, that friction wasn't a flaw, it was the entire point. Every trip back to an item box was a decision, every hallway you crossed to swap gear was another chance to get ambushed. The inventory wasn't separate from the horror, it was the horror. Then Resident Evil 4 turned the whole thing into a spatial puzzle. The attaché case gave you a grid, and every weapon, every egg, every fish you inexplicably decided to keep had a physical shape that needed to fit. Players spent genuine minutes rotating a rifle to squeeze in one more box of handgun rounds, and you couldn't drop items. No storage boxes. Whatever you discarded was gone permanently. That decision to throw away a flash grenade for a new scope? Real consequence baked into a menu screen. Fans genuinely loved this. Community posts describe organizing the attaché case as its own mini-game, something satisfying and tactical that made every resource feel meaningful, which is, not ideal for Capcom's later design philosophy, because later titles simplified everything. Bigger inventories, more generous drops, less spatial reasoning. And from a pure convenience standpoint, sure, nobody's crying over fewer trips to storage, but a vocal chunk of the fan base argues something essential was lost. When your inventory stops being a constraint, it stops being a source of tension. And when tension leaves resource management, you're one step closer to just being a shooter with zombies in it. But if you think agonizing over inventory space is bad for tension, wait until you realize the games have an even bigger problem with stakes. Specifically, the complete lack of them for anyone whose name is on the box art. The main protagonist armor and lack of stakes. Chris Redfield has been punched through walls, thrown off buildings, exposed to multiple bioweapons, caught in explosions, and stood next to an active volcano. He's fine. Leon Kennedy has been impaled, infected, beaten unconscious by creatures that could level a city block, and dropped from heights that would turn a normal person into abstract art. Also fine. Jill Valentine was literally mind-controlled by Wesker for years, while pumped full of experimental chemicals. She came back looking great, actually. Here's the thing. Resident Evil calls itself survival horror, but the survival part only applies to people who aren't on the box art. Plot armor in this franchise isn't subtle. It's not even trying to hide. The main characters exist in a state of permanent narrative immunity where lethal threats become inconveniences and catastrophic injuries heal between cutscenes. And look, every long-running franchise protects its leads to some degree. That's just storytelling. But Resident Evil does it while simultaneously killing side characters in horrific ways to prove how dangerous the situation is. The random BSAA soldier gets dissolved by acid in seconds. Chris, standing 3 feet away, takes the same hit and shakes it off like a bee sting. This creates a stakes problem that compounds with every entry. When you've watched Leon survive his 15th impossible scenario, the 16th one doesn't hit the same. Your brain stops processing, will he make it? Because the answer is always yes. Always. Without exception. The tension evaporates because you're not watching a person in danger. You're watching a mascot fulfilling contractual obligations. And it's not just physical survival. These characters rarely carry meaningful psychological weight between games either. Chris gets a bit broody in Resident Evil 6, sure, but by the next appearance, he's essentially reset. Nobody's permanently scarred, nobody's diminished, nobody retires because their body physically can't do this anymore. They just show up again, slightly buffer, ready for another round. The community has talked about this extensively, and the criticism usually boils down to one question. How can a game be scary when the person you're controlling is functionally immortal? Secondary characters die to establish threat. Main characters survive to sell sequels. That imbalance isn't a bug in the system. It is the system, which is, not ideal for a horror franchise. But if protagonist invincibility is a storytelling problem, Capcom's multiplayer experiments are an entirely different kind of failure. The modern live service and multiplayer failures. Capcom has been trying to make Resident Evil work as a multiplayer franchise for years now, and every single time, it falls flat on its face. Umbrella Corps, Resident Evil Resistance, RE-Verse. 3 swings, 3 misses, and somehow they keep stepping up to the plate like this time it'll be different. Here's the thing. Resident Evil works because of isolation, because of atmosphere, because you're alone in a building full of things that want to eat you. The second you throw 4 other players into that equation, all of that evaporates. You can't be scared when your teammate is teabagging a zombie corpse in the corner. Umbrella Corps tried to turn the franchise into a competitive tactical shooter, which is a bit like turning a haunted house into a laser tag arena. The mechanics were generic. The connection to anything people loved about Resident Evil was surface level at best, and the player base vanished almost immediately. Then came Resistance, bundled with the Resident Evil 3 remake like a party favor nobody asked for. An asymmetrical multiplayer mode where one player controls the mastermind while survivors try to escape. Cool concept on paper. In practice, the average concurrent player count on Steam sits around 47. For a mode attached to one of the biggest horror franchises on the planet. That's not a community, that's a book club. RE. Verse continued the pattern. Another multiplayer experiment, another lukewarm reception, another mode that felt bolted onto a franchise that never needed it. The community has been saying the same thing for years. Stop trying to make multiplayer happen. It's not going to happen, and the skepticism makes sense. Every hour spent on a multiplayer mode that'll be dead within 6 months is an hour that could have gone toward campaign content, toward story, toward the things people actually buy these games for. Survival horror is built to be unfair, oppressive, to make you feel like the game is actively working against you. That's the opposite of what keeps people grinding ranked matches at 2 a.m. The question isn't whether these experiments failed. They objectively did. The question is whether Capcom will finally stop trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Because if there's one thing worse than a failed multiplayer mode, it's a timeline that can't decide what actually happened, which is exactly where we're headed next. The timeline. Splintering and remake canon confusion. Here's the thing about being a Resident Evil fan in 2026. Almost half the experience is just figuring out what's actually canon. Not what happens in the games, but what's supposed to be real within the story. Because nobody can give you a straight answer anymore. Let me explain. The original Resident Evil 2 had this zapping system where you could play as Leon or Claire first, and your choice changed what happened in the other character's scenario. Items shifted around. Events changed. The supposed canon is Claire A, Leon B, but you won't find that spelled out anywhere official. Most players just picked whoever looked cooler and moved on, spinning off into their own wrong timelines without knowing it. That was manageable. Then the remakes came along. The Resident Evil 2 remake reimagines everything. Locations, character interactions, even major plot points. Now there are 2 versions of the same story, both official, both definitive. Nobody confirms if the remake replaces the original or if they coexist, or if this is some kind of reboot. I don't know what to tell you, but wait, it gets messier. These contradictions aren't just big picture stuff. Resident Evil 4, for example, establishes Leon as a non-smoker, but other materials show him lighting up. Tiny details that matter when multiplied by 3 decades of sequels, prequels, spin-offs, and localization quirks. The timeline looks less like a story and more like a conspiracy board in a detective's basement. Every new game means fans must redo the entire history they thought they knew. Remakes rewrite events. Side stories introduce conflicting details. Spin-offs hover in canonical limbo, only acknowledged if Capcom feels like it. So the fanbase responds by piecing together elaborate timelines, making deep dive videos, and debating obsessively, like lore detectives desperate for answers. That's the real struggle here. A franchise running for 30 years, trying to reinvent itself again and again, while pretending it's one continuous universe. Fans crave continuity, meaning, and respect for their time spent unraveling virus origins and character arcs. They want confirmation that their hard work hasn't been erased every time a new creative team reimagines something. But Capcom keeps pushing forward, remaking, retconning, and the fans keep chasing, reconstructing constructing, debating. It's an identity crisis disguised as a continuity crisis, fueled by a community that cares more about this timeline than the people writing it apparently do, which is, not ideal. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.